All right, so are you ready to dive into some pretty intense stuff today? We're talking psychopathy and manipulation. Ever get that feeling like someone's kind of pulling your strings? Well, today we're going to give you the tools to spot those tactics. And more importantly, we're going to help you figure out how to push back.
You know, it's interesting. When we think of psychopaths, we often think of those larger-than-life villains you see in movies. But the reality is they're often hiding right there in plain sight.
And that's exactly what Thomas Erickson's book, Surrounded by Psychopaths, dives right into. That's our mission for you today, to help you walk away with a better understanding of how to not be a pawn in anyone's game.
It's like we're giving you a mental toolkit for decoding human behavior.
The book starts with this story about a guy, a seemingly charming guy at one of Erickson's lectures, someone who later turned out to be a manipulator. And it really sets the stage for just how these people can really be anywhere.
That anecdote really highlights the fact that psychopathy exists on a spectrum. We're not just talking about the extremes you see in films. It's estimated that 2 to 4% of the population exhibits psychopathic traits. These are people who are often incredibly good at blending in.
So how do we even begin to define psychopathy? I mean, it's not like there's some giant flashing sign above their heads.
Yeah, and that's where it gets tricky. There are professional tools like Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, but for our purposes today, it's more about recognizing the signs.
And those signs can be pretty subtle, right? We're not talking about cartoon villains twirling their mustaches here.
Exactly. One of the things that Erickson emphasizes is that psychopaths are masters of manipulation. They can adapt their behavior to exploit your weaknesses, no matter what your personality type is.
Okay, so he actually uses the DISC system in this book, which you might know from his other book, Surrounded by Idiots, the whole red, yellow, green, blue personality types.
But here's the key difference. Psychopaths don't actually have a genuine DISC color. They're like chameleons, constantly shifting to mirror whoever they're trying to manipulate.
So it's not as simple as saying, oh, that person is a red, so they must be a psychopath.
No, it's much more nuanced than that. For example, someone with a strong red personality might be very direct and assertive, but that doesn't necessarily make them a psychopath. Psychopaths, on the other hand, use those red traits as a mask to get what they want.
It's almost like they're weaponizing your own personality against you.
Precisely. They observe your behavior, identify your vulnerabilities, and then they exploit them for their own gain. What's fascinating is that each DISC color actually has its own set of weaknesses that manipulators can target.
So no matter what your personality type is, you're potentially vulnerable.
That's what makes this so relevant to everybody. Let's take reds, for example. They're often driven and ambitious, maybe even a little bit domineering.
So someone who thrives on being in control.
Exactly. A psychopath might play into that by initially appearing to admire their strength and competence.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, they're subtly undermining their authority.
It's almost like they're using someone's strength as a way to bring them down.
Exactly. And Erickson actually has this story about a CEO. Her name is Pernilla, who's a classic red, and her subordinate Mike.
Okay.
So Mike, he doesn't directly challenge Pernilla. Instead, he positions himself as her confidant, feeding her ego while slowly chipping away at her power base.
So sneaky.
Then you have yellows, the social butterflies who thrive on connection and approval.
So someone who's afraid of being left out.
No.
Or rejected.
Exactly. And a manipulator might exploit that fear by isolating them from their support network.
Makes sense. And there's that story about Anna and Lars where Anna gradually convinces Lars that all his friends are turning against him.
It's a classic case of preying on someone's need for belonging. And by isolating Lars, Anna gains more control over him.
Yeah, makes sense. And what about greens? Those peacemakers who avoid conflict at all costs. How do those types get manipulated?
Greens. They can be manipulated by those who use anger or guilt trips, maybe even threats, to get their way.
So they're so averse to conflict that they'll just give in just to keep the peace.
Exactly. Erickson actually shares a story about Katie and Ed. Ed uses Katie's desire for harmony to basically control her finances and even her relationships. He flies into a rage if she ever questions him. And then he plays the victim, making her feel guilty for even bringing it up.
That's such a manipulative tactic to make someone feel bad for just asserting their own needs.
And finally, we have the blues. The logical, detail-oriented types who value facts and accuracy.
So you would think they would be like the hardest to manipulate, right? Because they're not as easily swayed by emotions?
You'd think so, but they can be tricked by those who present like a hyper-rational facade. Then they slowly distort reality to fit their own agenda. Erickson gives the example of Roger and George. Roger wants George's position, so he subtly makes it seem like George is the one making all the mistakes.
Oh, wow.
It's a case of manipulating perception to create a false reality. And because blues are so focused on logic and data, they can be blind to these subtle distortions.
Wow, this is all pretty unsettling. It's like everyone has a target on their back.
In a way, yes. But the good news is once you understand the tactics, you can start to recognize them and you can build your defenses.
Okay, so we've talked about how psychopaths can exploit different personality types. But what about some of the more specific manipulation tactics that they use? I mean, how do these things actually play out in real life?
Well, one of the most insidious tactics is gaslighting, making the victim doubt their own sanity.
It's like that classic movie Gaslight, right?
Oh,
Where
yeah.
the husband manipulates the gaslights to make his wife think that she's going crazy.
Exactly. Erickson uses this great analogy of a crooked picture that keeps getting straightened but mysteriously keeps becoming crooked again. If you're the only one who notices it, you start to wonder if you're imagining things.
So it's like they're subtly shifting your reality.
And then there's the story about Anelli from the book. The manipulator purposely distorts memories that they share together to make the victim question their recollection of events. It's all a mind game designed to make you doubt yourself.
That's incredibly scary because, like, our memories are so fundamental to who we are.
Exactly. And when someone starts to manipulate those memories, it can really shake your sense of self.
So gaslighting is all about making you question your own perception of reality. Are there other tactics that are more about, like, control and punishment?
Absolutely. One that comes to mind, and honestly one that kind of hits close to home for me, is the silent treatment. I've been on the receiving end of that, and it's incredibly painful. The silent treatment is a really powerful tool for manipulators because it preys on our innate need for connection. It creates this void where communication used to be, and it leaves you feeling isolated and desperate to fix things.
It's almost like a form of emotional manipulation, right?
Yeah.
Because you're left wondering, what did I do wrong? How do I make this better?
Exactly. And the manipulator, they're using that silence to control your emotions and your behavior. You're left walking on eggshells trying to figure out what will break the silence.
Okay, so we've talked about how to spot some of these manipulation tactics.
Yeah.
But what can we actually do about it? I mean, how do we stop feeling like a victim?
Well, thankfully, Erickson actually provides a 6-step plan for reclaiming your power. It's all about shifting that dynamic from one of control to one of empowerment.
Okay, let's break it down, because I think this is what our listeners are really craving, some actionable steps.
The first step is recognizing the pattern. Once you can start to see the tactics being used, you're less likely to fall for them.
So knowledge is power, I guess, in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. Next, resist that urge to react immediately. Manipulators often rely on provoking an emotional response to get what they want.
So don't let them push your buttons.
Right. Step 3 is what Erickson calls the think technique. It's about creating space between the stimulus and your response. Instead of reacting impulsively, take a moment to pause and consider your options.
I mean, that could be tough, though, especially when you're feeling triggered or you're caught off guard.
It takes practice, but it is essential. Think of it like hitting that pause button on a recording. You're taking a moment to collect yourself before you decide how to proceed.
So don't just react. Respond.
Exactly. And when you do respond, step 4 is putting it into words. Erickson recommends using the when you, I feel framework. It's clear, and it's an assertive way to communicate your experience without blaming or accusing.
For example, instead of saying, you're always making me feel bad, you could say, when you raise your voice, I feel intimidated and disrespected.
That's a great example. It's about owning your feelings and expressing them in a way that invites dialogue rather than escalating conflict.
Okay, what's next?
Step 5 is where you really start to reclaim your power. It's about destroying the manipulation. This means being consistent and not falling for those same tricks again.
So the manipulator might test your boundaries, right? They might try and see if their old tactics still work.
Exactly. They might try to guilt you or gaslight you or use any of the other tactics we've discussed. But the key is to stay strong and to hold firm to those new rules of engagement, the ones that you've established.
It's about breaking free from that cycle of manipulation.
And finally, step 6 is about explaining your conditions for future interactions. This is where you set clear boundaries and expectations for how you want to be treated.
That can be a tough conversation, though, right? Especially with someone who's used to getting their way.
It can be, but it's crucial. You're essentially saying, this is how I expect to be treated,
Yeah.
and if you can't respect that, then we can't have a relationship.
It's about taking control of your own life and choosing who you allow to have influence over you. So with all this in mind, is there any hope for dealing with psychopaths? I mean, can they ever truly change?
That's a difficult question. While there's always a chance for personal growth and change, Erickson's view, and one I tend to agree with, is that psychopaths are unlikely to change their fundamental nature.
So hoping to fix them is probably not a realistic strategy.
It's more about protecting yourself. You can't change someone else, but you can change how you interact with them.
And that's really the takeaway here, right? We're not trying to diagnose or treat psychopathy, but rather we're trying to give our listener the tools to navigate those relationships more effectively.
Exactly. And one thing that Erickson really emphasizes is that you shouldn't feel bad for setting boundaries and protecting yourself. You have a right to be treated with respect, and you don't have to tolerate manipulation from anyone.
That's a powerful message. But it also brings up a bigger question. If psychopaths are so skilled at manipulating others, are we all susceptible to it to some degree?
That's a fascinating question, and one that Erickson actually touches on with an example of human laboratory mice, where researchers used positive and negative reinforcement to condition certain behaviors. It makes you wonder how much of our own behavior is shaped by external forces.
It is a bit unsettling to think that we might be more malleable than we realize.
It is, but it also highlights the importance of self-awareness. The more we understand about how our minds work and how we're influenced by others, the better equipped we are to make conscious choices about our behavior.
So it's not just about spotting psychopaths. It's about understanding the dynamics of human behavior in general.
Precisely. And that's what makes this topic so relevant to everyone. Whether you're dealing with a manipulative coworker, a difficult family member, or even just trying to navigate the complexities of social media, understanding these principles can empower you to make more informed choices.
Yeah, it makes you think about all those times when you just had a gut feeling about someone, but you couldn't quite put your finger on why. Maybe it was just like this subtle sense of unease or a feeling that something wasn't quite right.
You know, those gut feelings, those are often our intuition trying to warn us. We've been conditioned to kind of ignore them or to downplay them, but they can actually be really valuable tools, especially for navigating those complex social situations.
So it's not just about being hyper vigilant for psychopaths. It's about also trusting our own instincts.
Exactly. If something feels off, it probably is. It's okay to just step back and assess the situation. And, you can even remove yourself from it entirely if you have to.
Yeah. This whole deep dive has been pretty eye-opening for me. It's like I've been given this new lens for understanding how people interact and how easily we can be influenced.
That's the power of knowledge, right? Once you understand the tactics, you're less likely to be caught off guard.
So if we could distill everything we've learned into one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
I would say that you have the power to choose how you respond to manipulation. Remember Erickson's 6-step plan. Recognize the pattern. Resist that urge to react immediately. Use the think technique. Put it into words. Destroy the manipulation. And explain your conditions for future interactions. These are your tools for reclaiming your power.
And remember, psychopaths don't change. Trying to fix them, that's a waste of your time and energy. Focus on protecting yourself by setting boundaries and knowing when to walk away.
Trust your gut, and never be afraid to seek support if you need it. You're not alone in this.
This has been an incredible deep dive, a little unnerving at times, but ultimately it's been really empowering. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating and sometimes disturbing world of human behavior.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, stay curious and stay empowered.